All right, so today we're going to be looking at some executive orders
Yeah.
from the Trump administration that are targeting transgender individuals.
Okay.
And we're going to be taking a deep dive with a Mother Jones report
Right.
that analyzes this whole situation.
Interesting.
And I thought one of the most interesting things about this report is that it focuses
Yeah.
on how institutions
Hmm.
are responding to these orders, even while
Mm-hmm.
the legality of them is
Yeah.
still up in the air.
Yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon that the article calls preemptive obedience.
Right.
It's basically, it seems that institutions are scrambling to comply with these orders.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like,
And
is it just fear
Yeah.
of legal repercussions?
Legal challenges are underway.
Or is there something more at play here?
Yeah.
And then also the scope of these orders
Right.
is pretty extensive, right?
Yeah.
We're talking healthcare, education, employment.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like they're trying to impact almost every aspect of life for transgender people.
It's definitely a wide-reaching approach.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that the administration seems to be using these orders
Okay.
to push a very specific definition of sex.
Interesting.
One that aligns with biological sex assigned at birth.
So it's not
But Dr.
just
Savixley has...
about individual policies,
Yeah.
but a fundamental shift in how gender
Right.
is understood at a legal and societal level.
Exactly.
That's pretty huge.
And it gets even more complex when
Yeah.
you look at how this clashes
Okay.
with existing legal protections.
Right.
So, for example, the landmark Bostock v. Clayton County
Right.
Supreme Court ruling explicitly prohibits workplace discrimination based on gender identity
Oh.
and sexual orientation.
Uh-huh.
But some of these executive orders...
So we've got this legal battle brewing,
Yeah.
seem to directly contradict that.
Exactly. And in the meantime,
Yeah.
institutions are caught in the crossfire.
Right. And the article highlights some pretty stark examples of this preemptive obedience in action,
Yeah.
like hospitals canceling gender-affirming care for minors,
Right.
even though state attorneys general
Mm-hmm.
are arguing that the order is illegal.
Right. And that speaks to
So are they just trying to
immense pressures.
Sure. that these institutions are facing?
Yeah.
I mean, the Trump administration has been pretty clear
Okay.
that federal funding could be on the line
Right.
for those who don't comply.
Yeah. And that makes sense when you think about,
When you consider that public two-year colleges,
like, how much money
these
to
institutes
devote over a quarter of their funding
right, from the government.
from the federal government.
Yeah.
You can see how the stakes are incredibly high.
So it's not just about interpreting the law,
Right.
but about navigating this power dynamic
Yeah.
where institutions are essentially being forced to choose
Exactly.
between upholding trans rights
Right.
and risking their financial stability.
It's a really tough position for a lot of these
Yeah.
institutions to be in.
And that creates a chilling effect.
Absolutely.
Don't you think?
Even institutions with a history of supporting LGBTQ plus rights
Right.
are suddenly finding themselves
Like, what about it?
in a very precarious position.
Places like Harvard or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The article mentions Harvard University,
Wow.
which actually removed its transgender inclusion policy from its website
Seriously.
following Trump's sports ban executive order.
Wow, that's really telling.
Yeah.
If even an institution with their resources and legal clout is backing down,
Uh-huh.
what does that say about the level of pressure
Right.
other institutions are feeling?
The strategic nature of these
Mhm.
executive orders
Okay.
by targeting funding and bypassing typical legislative processes.
So they're making it so that
The administration is creating a situation where institutions
are almost incentivized to comply.
they're almost incentivized to comply, even if it means compromising their values
Right.
or potentially violating the law.
And that brings us back to the human cost of all of this.
Right.
You know, we're talking
I
about
believe you're absolutely.
real people whose lives are being directly impacted by these decisions.
Yeah, the article quotes
The article quotes Gillian Brandstetter
Gillian Brandstetter
from the ACLU,
from the ACLU.
who argues that the administration is attempting to control the bodies and lives
Mhm.
of transgender people,
Right.
driving them from public spaces.
Yeah,
It's a pretty stark assessment.
it is.
You know, one of the most disturbing examples in the article
And when you look at cases,
was the case of federal prisons
like federal prisons being ordered to rehouse trans women in men's facilities.
being ordered to rehouse trans women in men's facilities.
It really underscores
It raises some serious questions about
the potential dangers involved.
the disregard for their safety and well-being.
This isn't just about abstract legal debates.
Yeah.
It's about the safety and well-being.
Yeah, it's about people's lives.
Individuals.
Right.
That's a prime example.
So that's like a really
Preemptive obedience
concrete example of where preemptive
can have devastating consequences,
obedience
forcing some trans women
and have these like
to detransition.
which can be incredibly damaging both psychologically and physically.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the administration is using these orders to roll back the clock on trans rights.
Yeah. It feels
throwing
like
years of progress.
a deliberate strategy to marginalize
And legal precedent.
and silence an entire community.
Yeah.
But the article also points out that this isn't happening in a vacuum.
This isn't happening in a vacuum.
There's a broader context here, right?
Definitely, these executive orders are part of a larger conservative movement that's been gaining momentum.
Yeah. So it's not just a top-down approach.
We're seeing similar efforts to restrict
LGBTQ plus rights,
but a multi-pronged effort that's playing out
particularly trans rights
across the country.
happening at the state level as well.
What does that mean for the future of transgender rights?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If this trend continues, it could have a significant impact on the legal landscape and the lives.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Of transgender people.
We've talked about the scope of the executive orders,
For years to
the concept of preemptive obedience, and the potential dangers for trans individuals.
Yeah.
But what about the pushback?
Yeah.
Surely there are people fighting back against these measures.
Absolutely.
Okay.
There's a lot of resistance building,
Yeah.
both from individuals and organizations.
There is pushback.
We'll dig into that more after a quick break.
Okay. So before the break, we were talking about how there's pushback against these executive orders.
Yeah.
It's not just a one-sided story.
Not at all.
Right.
In fact, there are some pretty significant challenges happening, both in the courts and through political action.
What are some of the key arguments being made against these orders?
Bostock is definitely
I know we touched on Bostock.
a major focal point.
But are there other legal grounds for challenging them?
With groups like Lambda Legal arguing that the administration is misinterpreting and undermining the Supreme Court's decision.
So they're saying that they're just not interpreting Bostock correctly.
You have state attorneys general filing lawsuits
Right.
claiming that these orders violate states' rights
Okay.
and exceed the administration's authority.
So you've got legal challenges coming from multiple angles.
Yeah.
What about on the ground?
Yeah.
Are there organized efforts
On the ground,
to support transgender people and push back against these policies?
the article highlights how parents of trans youth are filing lawsuits
Okay.
and advocating for their children's rights.
So they're getting involved as well.
You also have organizations like the ACLU and the Transgender Law Center providing legal resources and support for individuals who are being discriminated against.
It sounds like there's a real grassroots
There's a lot of
movement building to counter this top-down pressure
grassroots organizing happening
from the administration.
Yeah.
What are some of the key demands or goals of these groups?
A lot of the focus is on ensuring access to gender-affirming care,
Okay.
particularly for minors.
And making sure that there's also a big push
Trans students are protected.
to protect trans students' rights in schools,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to things like bathroom access and participation in sports.
It seems like the fight is really about ensuring that transgender people have the same basic rights and freedoms
I think that's a good way to put it.
as everyone else.
It's about recognizing that these rights are interconnected.
Right.
If transgender people are denied basic dignity and respect,
Yeah.
it sets a dangerous precedent.
And, speaking of interconnectedness, for other marginalized groups.
This whole situation reminds me of how the Biden administration had actually expanded protections
Yeah.
for transgender individuals.
That's right. The Biden administration.
It felt like things were moving
Made some significant strides,
in a positive direction for a while.
like recognizing gender dysphoria as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act,
Right.
which opened up new avenues for legal protection.
And there was the policy allowing intersex and non-binary people to select X as their gender marker on passports.
That was a big one.
It felt like a symbolic victory,
Symbolic.
but an important one nonetheless.
But also very practical in
Right.
terms of affirming people's identities and making it easier for them to travel and navigate the world.
But now with Trump back in office, it feels like we're taking a step backward.
It does feel like
Many of those advancements are being reversed or challenged.
A bit of a step backward.
Yeah, it's like a constant back and forth battle.
It is.
And I can only imagine
There's this sense of whiplash.
how exhausting and demoralizing that must be for transgender people
Yeah.
who are just trying to live their lives.
Where progress is made only to be followed by setbacks.
It raises the question of what the long-term implications might be.
It's a reminder that the fight
If these executive orders are allowed to stand,
for equality
could they pave the way for even more restrictive policies down the line?
and requires constant vigilance.
Could we see a broader erosion of rights?
Yeah.
Not just for transgender people,
That's a valid concern.
and for other marginalized groups as well.
It's important to remember that these orders
Because it's not just about transgender
are part of a broader
Right.
political strategy.
rights, but about
The article points to a conservative movement
a whole bunch of other rights as well.
that aims to redefine gender and sexuality
So it's not just about
in a way that aligns with their ideology.
specific policies, but about shaping the very language and framework through which we understand these issues.
It's about controlling the narrative.
That feels like a much more fundamental shift
Yeah.
with potentially far-reaching consequences.
And it goes beyond just the transgender community.
Like what?
We're seeing similar efforts to restrict reproductive rights,
Okay.
limit access to health care,
So a
and
range
curtail the rights of immigrants
That issues.
and other minority groups.
Yeah, it's all interconnected.
It's all interconnected.
So it's really about the
to
kind
make
of
the society you want to live in.
and what values we prioritize.
Live in.
Do we value inclusivity, diversity, and equal rights for all?
Exactly.
Or do we allow fear and prejudice
we're
to dictate our policies?
world do we want to create
For a choice we all have to make,
and for future generations?
both individually and collectively,
Yeah.
and the actions we take today
It's a big
will have a
concern
ripple effect
that we're all facing.
for generations to come.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the pushback against these executive orders,
Mm-hmm.
the broader political context,
Yeah.
and the potential long-term implications.
Right.
But I want to bring it back to the individual level for a moment.
Yeah.
How are transgender people coping with this wave of attacks?
Well, the article highlights
What stories are being shared in the article?
the incredible resilience and courage
Yes.
of transgender people who are facing these challenges head on.
Yeah, because it must be.
They're organizing, speaking out, and fighting for their rights
Yeah.
in the face of immense pressure.
What are some of the ways
That's
they're
it,
finding
sir.
strength and support
Community is a huge factor.
during this difficult time?
Trans people are finding solace and solidarity
Yeah,
in online spaces.
that makes sense.
Support groups and advocacy organizations.
Especially since you can find
They're sharing their stuff,
people from all over the country
offering advice,
going through
and lifting each other up.
similar things.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah, it's a reminder that even
human connection can be a powerful source
in the darkest times, human connection
and resilience.
can be really powerful.
And while there's a lot of fear and uncertainty right now,
Yeah,
the article also hints at a sense of determination,
that's good.
a refusal to be silenced
So there's hope as well.
or pushed back into the shadows.
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom.
Absolutely. That there's a real sense
Right.
that transgender people are not going to back down.
Good.
And they're not going to let their rights be taken away
They're going to keep fighting.
without a fight.
Yeah.
And that fight is taking many forms,
Like what?
from legal battles to grassroots activism
Okay.
to simply living their lives authentically and visibly.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder that progress is rarely linear
So they're fighting in lots of different ways.
and that setbacks are often followed by renewed determination.
Right. And it underscores
Yeah.
the importance of allyship.
Now, more than ever, it's crucial for those who are not transgender
Yeah. How can people be good allies?
to stand up and speak out in support of trans rights.
Yeah. What can they do?
That's a really
Because it can feel overwhelming.
important.
Like, where do you even start?
It can be easy to get caught up in the negative headlines,
Yeah.
but it's crucial to remember that there are people out there fighting every day
Okay.
to make the world a more just and equitable place.
Yeah, that's inspiring.
And their efforts are making a difference.
Yeah. It's good to remember that.
Absolutely.
It can be easy to get bogged down
And it's up to all of us
with all the bad
to
news.
join them in that fight.
So as we wrap up,
To use our voices and our actions.
That's part of our deep dive.
To create a world where everyone
I think it's important to acknowledge
can live authentically and freely.
both the gravity of the situation
That was sad.
and the power of resistance.
Yeah.
We're at a critical juncture.
I think that's a good
And the choices we make now will have a lasting impact
way to put it.
on the lives of transgender people
It's a critical moment.
and the future of our society as a whole.
For sure.
And it's not just about grand gestures or political pronouncements.
Grand gestures or political pronouncements.
It's about the everyday acts of kindness,
Yeah.
empathy, and understanding
That's about the everyday.
that can make a world of difference.
Acts of kindness, empathy, and understanding.
In someone's life.
That can make a world of difference in someone's life.
So what are some concrete steps our listeners can take
Yeah. What can people actually do
to show their support
to make a difference?
and make a positive impact?
We'll explore that in more detail.
It's a short break.
More detail after a short break. All right, so we've talked about the challenges, the pushback, the bigger picture, but what can our listeners actually do to support transgender rights?
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming.
It can feel overwhelming, right?
And where do you even start?
Like, where do you even start? Well, honestly, I think sometimes the simplest actions can have the biggest impact.
So, like, what are some
One of the most important things.
simple things that people can do?
Just to educate yourself.
Okay.
There are so many incredible resources out there from organizations like the ACLU.
Are there any, like,
Lambda Legal, the Transgender Law Center.
specific resources that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, all of those organizations have really comprehensive websites with tons of information.
So people can just Google those.
Yeah.
And that's a good starting point.
Exactly.
Okay.
And those resources aren't just for legal stuff. I mean, they often have guides.
Like how to be a better ally.
On how to be a better ally.
Okay.
How to have conversations with friends or family who might have misconceptions about trans issues.
It's hard to know even how to start those conversations.
Building understanding and empathy. And sometimes that starts with just listening to trans people, believing their experiences, confirming their identities.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something we touched on earlier, this idea of amplifying trans voices.
Yes.
It's not enough to just be non-discriminatory.
Right.
We need to actively create space for trans perspectives to be heard.
Absolutely.
So what does that look like?
Sharing articles.
Like, how do you do that?
Written by trans authors.
Okay.
Supporting trans artists and creators.
So supporting trans people.
Speaking out against transphobic jokes or comments.
Right. It's calling out.
Those are all ways to use your own platform.
Transphobia when you see it.
However big or small.
Yeah. And sometimes that can feel scary.
Yeah, it can.
But it's important to do.
But it's important to speak up. If you're looking for more hands-on ways.
More organized ways to get involved.
You could get involved supporting organizations that are working on the front lines.
Like donating?
Is huge.
Volunteering.
Volunteering your time. Even just helping to spread the word about their work.
So getting the word out.
Can make a big impact.
About the work these organizations are doing.
And never underestimate.
Yeah, and then also.
The power of contacting your elected officials.
Contacting your representative.
But let them know that you support policies.
Right, and just letting them know.
That protect transgender people.
That these are issues that people
care about.
Vote for candidates.
Yeah, and it's important.
Who have a track record of advocating for LGBTQ plus rights.
And vote for people.
It all adds up.
Who support.
Individual actions combined with collective effort.
These rights.
Can create real change.
Yeah, it all adds up.
But I think it's also important.
Yeah, individual actions, collective effort.
To acknowledge that this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right. This isn't going to be solved.
There will be setbacks. Moments of frustration. Yeah. And it's important to remember that.
Times when it feels like we're taking 2 steps back for every step forward.
When things get tough.
That's true. But it's important to remember.
If I give up.
That the arc of history bends toward justice. Even if it takes time and sustained effort.
Because the fight for equality is a long one.
The progress that has been made in recent years, even with the current pushback.
Yeah, and we've seen that.
Is a testament to the power of activism, advocacy, and the unwavering spirit of the trans community.
Throughout history, right?
Absolutely.
This isn't a new fight.
And I think it's up to all of us.
This has been going on.
To join them in that fight.
For a long time.
To use our voices and our actions.
So it's important too.
To create a world where everyone can live authentically and freely.
Learn from the past.
Yeah.
And to keep fighting.
I think that's a really important point.
for the future.
It can be easy to get caught up in the negative headlines.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that there are people out there fighting every day.
That's inspiring.
To make the world a more just and equitable place.
Yeah.
And their efforts are making a difference.
It's good to remember that.
Absolutely.
It can be easy to get bogged down.
And it's up to all of us.
And all the bad news.
To join them in that fight.
Yeah.
To use our voices and our actions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
to create a world where everyone can live authentically and freely.
I want to thank you for sharing
Well said.
your insights and expertise with us.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
And to our listeners,
Yeah.
we hope this conversation
Thanks for having me.
has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you
Of course.
to take action.
Anytime.
Remember, even small acts of kindness and allyship can make a big difference.